Hi, I'm Harriet Frew, eating disorder therapist, teacher and podcaster, and you're about to start healing from your eating disorder and transforming your life and your relationship with food and body. I've worked in NHS and private practice supporting clients for 20 years, and I believe that recovery is possible for you. This podcast dives into expert interviews, evidence-based psychological approaches, and anecdotal tips from the therapy room from my years of experience. If you're wanting to heal your relationship with food, feel confident in your body, develop self-love and self-acceptance, and create a life of freedom and meaning, then this podcast is for you. Thank you for being here. So today I have a guest on the show, and I am talking to Heidi Schuster, who is a nutrition therapist and somatic experiencing practitioner who has specialised in eating and body image concerns for nearly 30 years. Heidi provides individual and group counselling and clinical supervision/consultation and is particularly interested in the intersection between food and body concerns with trauma. Heidi considers herself a whole self wellness practitioner and embodiment warrior. She is the author of the award-winning book, Nourish: How to Heal Your Relationship with Food, Body and Self, and writes the Nourishing Words newsletter on Substack. Her most recent book is Nurture: How to Raise Kids Who Love Food, Their Bodies and Themselves. Heidi lives in Arlington, Massachusetts, USA, with her partner and twin daughters when they aren't in college. And she recently choreographed a modern dance piece about the empty nest, performed by an ensemble of women aged 40 plus. Heidi and her family enjoy most food that is lovingly prepared, especially if it's followed by a dishwashing dance party. So in the episode today, Heidi talks about how parents can support their young children and teens in navigating a healthy relationship with food and body. She talks about responding to your individual child and the delicate balance of providing structure with eating versus over-control. Heidi explains why it's unhelpful to have good and bad foods and how to navigate food neutrality within your home. Heidi talks about educating children around body diversity and calling out fat shaming and weight stigma. She explains about how we will be imperfect as parents and sometimes get it wrong when navigating all of this. And Heidi helpfully normalises how many parents are dealing with their own food issues and how they can still support their children. She deeply advocates for food as pleasure and nourishment, for connection and joy, in addition to nutrition. So much value packed in this episode. Let's get to the conversation. Hi, Heidi. Welcome to the Eating Disorder Therapist podcast.
Harriet, thank you so much for having me. It's good to be here.
So Heidi, could I firstly get you to introduce yourself to the listeners, please?
Sure. My name is Heidi Schuster, and I am a Boston, Massachusetts area eating disorders specialist. I've been working in the eating disorders field for almost 30 years now. I'm a nutrition therapist or a registered dietitian, however you want to call me. My focus is on the nutrition piece. That's been my training, but I also have certification in somatic experiencing. So I'm also a somatic experiencing practitioner, which means that I work on a body level around trauma. So that's my general specialty. I have a history myself of an eating disorder back when I was an adolescent. So I come to my work with lived experience, as well as obviously lots of clinical experience at this point. I've studied lots of different modalities, and I'm just so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Okay, thanks, Heidi. And before we sort of launch in, actually, do you want to just give a shout out to your books? Now, you've recently birthed a new book into the world, haven't you? But I believe you have previous books as well. So just so I make sure I don't forget this, can you just give us a little bit of an overview of your books, please?
Sure. Authors love to talk about their books, right? My first book, I have two books that I've written. My first one came out in 2018, and it's called Nourish. The subtitle is How to Heal Your Relationship with Food, Body, and Self. And that has done very well. I'm very happy with the feedback that I've been receiving since 2018. And this past year, I decided to publish another book called Nurture. And the subtitle is How to Raise Kids Who Love Food, their bodies and themselves. So when my first book came out, so many people gave me the feedback, oh, I wish I had had this information. I wish my parents had had this information. I wish I had it a long time ago. You should write something for parents and caregivers of kids. So that's what I did. I set out to do. So this past January, the book was published, and I've been talking about it ever since.
Fantastic. And Heidi, is it actually out in the UK as well? Like, obviously, it's out in the US, isn't it already? Yeah.
It's available everywhere through Amazon.
Okay, no, fantastic. Well, I should make sure that I put the links in the show notes. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I guess, like, leading on, perhaps particularly from your second book, talking about supporting parents to raise children to have a healthy relationship with food, their bodies, themselves. I know many people who are listening struggle with disordered eating, eating disorders, and they are raising children at the moment. And they're feeling really, really anxious about not wanting to pass on habits, behaviors, thoughts about food to their offspring. For anyone listening, I guess, who is really identifying with this, what can you say to them to kind of give them some advice in terms of how not to kind of repeat history and how to support their children with having a healthier relationship with food?
Yeah, it's such a great question, and it's such a big question, which is why I wrote a book about it. But ultimately, I think the best thing that we can do as parents and caregivers of children is to do our own work, to really keep working on our own self-care, our own body care, our own relationship with food, and continuing to work on trying to be more accepting around our bodies and the changes that inevitably happen with bodies as we age. To really do that work ourselves as parents, I think is so critical. That's like number one. And then, of course, we live in a challenging culture around all of this. We can't wholly protect our children from the culture by any means, but we can try to create a culture in our homes around food and also around bodies and body diversity that is supportive of kids growing up in a way that they will be more accepting of themselves and more balanced with food. Even though that the toxic culture is out there, the more we can create a culture of acceptance and a culture where food is part of daily life and easeful, the more that we can ensure that kids are going to have a more easeful relationship with it too.
So would you say as well, so much of it is about, as an individual, as a parent, even just having that kind of awareness, like recognizing your own issues, noticing when stuff's coming up. And then I guess, yeah, doing the work on it yourself, investing in yourself. But in a way, by doing that, that's going to have a really powerful kind of ripple effect in terms of like how your children are then going to relate to food, because I guess you're then showing up with much more intention and thought, aren't you? Whereas I sometimes think the damage is done often more when we're unaware, and it's just kind of leaking out, isn't it? Through not really even recognizing that we're doing damage.
Right. And even those of us who have done our work, and someone like myself who's been in the field for decades, I still have said stuff to my daughters that I went, ooh, did I really say that? Did that come out of my mouth? It's just a product of our culture or our family culture that we grew up in. I think all we can do is sort of notice those missteps and correct them as much as possible. Like say, oh, I said something about my body there that I wish I hadn't said. I'm going to try to be kinder to myself today. Or, oh, I said something about food that I didn't mean to say. It doesn't make sense. I'm going to actually take that back. I want us all to enjoy everything at the table. Again, even someone who's studied this stuff, I write about it in my book. I've made mistakes too. And even my daughters, once they became teenagers, they called me on stuff too. Like you'll see that in some of the quotes that my daughters were so kind to allow me to put in the book, where they kind of called me on something that I said that maybe wasn't so great, kind about my body, for example. I think all we can do is do our best to try to create a culture of acceptance and know that part of the journey is that we're going to make mistakes, But at least if we have that awareness, as you say, we will be able to make corrections or have some really useful conversations that are important, that will help our children and our teens to work with the culture that's around
Yeah.
them.
No, I think it's so helpful, isn't it? It's like real permission to be imperfect and recognizing
Yep.
you're going to say the wrong thing and that's okay. Yeah, you can repair it, can't you? And you can use it as a chance for a conversation, an educational opportunity. And I think something I found, I don't know if you relate to this, Heidi, that I realized as a mother as well, I am one segment of a pie of influence.
Yes.
And
A
I
little one
think,
sometimes.
yeah, you can have some influence, but you can't completely protect them from the culture, can you? That was a bit of a hurdle for me, I think, really, and just really accepting that. And also realizing, I think my children at times have seen me as a bit of a sort of intuitive eating almond mum, like an intuitive eating. I mean, like becoming a bit over controlling in terms of intuitive eating. And that's a turn off as well, isn't it? In a way, you're
Sure.
trying to show up and give all these kind of healthy, positive messages. But also, if you come on a bit too strong with your children, particularly as they're teenagers, that can be a bit repellent as well. So it is a really fine line, isn't it, to walk that tightrope?
Absolutely. And I write a lot about that actually, because I have also come on strong at times with sort of my anti-diet message too. And I certainly don't want to then push my kids in the other way as they're doing their separation and trying to sort of be different than their mom, for example. Ultimately, no one wants to live up to a perfect parent. So it is okay to make mistakes and own our mistakes and bumble along with it. But I totally agree. I think we have to be careful that we're not too dogmatic about anything. That said, I have to say that I think sometimes being dogmatic about the diversity of bodies has been helpful to my daughters. I always tell this story because I think it touched me so much that when I heard my daughter saying to her friend, who was saying something like, I'm so fat. When I heard her reply, well, you're not fat, but even if you were, no big deal. That's just a different body type. I was like, okay, that sunk in, something sunk in. So I do think there is something to be said for really correcting the language that's out there around certain bodies are better than other bodies because it's so pervasive. And I think if we can be a little bit of a broken record with our children, then it gives them a little bit of armor for what's out there in the culture around bodies, want some bodies being better than others.
Sure. Yeah. No, I can actually really see actually around the kind of body image piece, how being a bit more dogmatic. I mean, that was amazing, wasn't it, to hear your daughter say that? You're just like, yes. It has really been sinking in. But I guess with food, sometimes that can sometimes be a bit more of a difficult balance to navigate, can't it? Because I think as well as parents, particularly when our children are primary school age. So in the UK, I'm talking about, I guess, like under 11 years old or whatever, before they hit the
Mhm.
teenage years, we do need to have kind of some boundaries and structure and kind of guidelines for our children. We don't want to kind of just let them loose completely with food. They need a bit of guidance, don't they? But I think sometimes it's a difficult balance, isn't it, to walk that line in a way where you're providing structure, but also you're allowing them to really listen to their bodies and be intuitive. And do you have a few sort of thoughts around navigating that?
Yeah, I have lots of thoughts about that, which is probably why I wrote it. But I think it's challenging. And you also have to know your kid well, too, your child, because some children are natural intuitive eaters and they really are in their bodies and listen to their bodies. And I think we all started out that way in general. But I think that for some children, for example, who might be a little bit more neurodivergent or who they're more distracted by life, they might need more structure, for example, around food than some other children who just kind of are able to be more naturally intuitive. So I think you have to kind of know your kids well and then kind of figure out, well, okay, how much structure do I need to put around meals and snacks? I think some structure is always helpful. I love Ellen Satter's golden rule I don't know if you're familiar with Ellen Satter, but for a long time, she's kind of divided the responsibility around feeding, where parents are responsible for providing a variety of like nutritious foods, and then children are responsible for actually eating them and deciding how much of it they want. I think when we start to move over into the child's responsibility and then like be affecting how much they're eating, like eat a little bit more of that or eat a little less of that, that's I think when we're overstepping a boundary. And I think that's what we have to be most careful of. And it's so easy to do that because there's so much morality around food. But I think if we can decrease the morality around food for children and just provide good, balanced options and then let them sort of choose what works for their bodies, I think that it seems to be most helpful for everyone.
Sure. And what about, I guess, if you have a child that's a particularly picky eater and just doesn't want to eat any vegetables at all, and you're a bit worried about their health, what would you say then in terms of like, would you modify the approach at all?
Yeah, it's a great question. Most garden variety picky eating will go away over time. It's really natural for young people to have food jags, times when they just aren't interested in certain textures or colors. And if you have a cautious child that is just naturally cautious, then they might be more picky as well with food. All of that is very common, and it tends to just be something that kids grow out of, and they go up and down with pickiness. And generally, I think if parents stay calm and don't get too upset about it, then it doesn't turn into something bigger, which is a little bit more of a power struggle. This child is maybe trying to exert some independence by refusing a food that this young person can tell the parent wants them to eat. Occasionally, picky eating can turn into something more serious like ARFID, but that's a special case and it's unusual. Picky eating, again, if we can just stay really calm about it and keep reintroducing foods, they'll grow out of it. The research that I did for my book, we found that like 13 to 30 times is the number of times kids might need to try something before they accept it. And obviously, if you have a more cautious child, it might be more like the 30 times versus the 13. Keep in mind that you want to keep offering food. Would this be a good night for you to try a little bit of carrot again and see if you like it now? When I was little, I didn't like them either, but now I do. So I'm wondering if this might be a good night for you to try it again. Give it a try. Again, really neutrally offering the food. And if they say no, then like move on. Don't get too upset about it. Pick your battles. But for the most part, continuing to reintroduce those foods usually helps in the long run.
Sure. Yeah, that's very helpful. And I guess that the challenge for the parent is trying to stay neutral, isn't it? Because I think as a parent, our
Yes.
anxiety often can really spike, can't it? And before we know
Mhm.
it, we've stepped in, been a bit over controlling, we're starting to create an issue. There's a lot of tension around the food. So it sounds like kind of a bit of thought ahead and really sort of just engaging with this kind of neutral approach, offering choice, engaging with the long game, realizing you may have to repeat this multiple times, but that's okay. It's part of the process.
Yeah. And that's where, like, as parents, we have to work on our own self regulation. We might be anxious about our child who hasn't had a vegetable this week, but the reality is that maybe they're going through a growth spurt and vegetables are not the most energy, calorie dense foods. And perhaps that's not best for them this week while they're going through a major growth spurt. To sort of believe that their body knows best and it's probably just a phase, and the more we stay neutral about it, the less it's likely to turn into something bigger and become a power struggle. I think if you can hold that and just breathe, take a time out if you need to, so that you can stay really neutral about food. Because I think the more like food is neutral and joyful in a house, the less likely food is to become problematic. I think obviously like eating disorders we know happen for so many different reasons. It's not just about a diet gone bad, But I do think that having a sort of more moralistic and diet oriented perspective around food in the house definitely creates a big risk factor for eating disorders later in
Yeah,
children.
sure. And then what about the whole sugar thing? As in the US, as in the UK, there's a lot of scaremongering, isn't there? I think parents become extremely anxious now about giving their children the right foods, and then they can be kind of led to feel they're doing the right thing by creating a lot of rules, banning certain foods, perhaps inadvertently almost creating a sense of deprivation for children, where these foods then become really sort of special. And when they go to a party, they go completely crazy and load up on all the sugar. How would you navigate that in terms of helping children develop that kind of peaceful, more self-regulated place around sugar and other treat foods?
Yeah, that's also an amazing question. And again, all children are a little bit different. However, most children do better with a more moderate approach to sweets. That's what I see over and over in my practice. And I saw it certainly growing up when my daughters were young. It was their friends who were from sugar-free households that would come over and be looking for their Halloween candy, which is something that was collecting dust on the shelf at our house, but their friends were looking for it months later because that was the only opportunity they got to eat it. So I do think I've watched my daughters grow up with a pretty neutral attitude about sweets. They do like to bake. They occasionally have cookies, but they don't tend to get bingy around those foods. I think because they've always been very neutral in our house. And I have not seen that in kids who have grown up in a more restricted house. So I do think there's something to be said for being more neutral and being more moderate around sugar versus saying, absolutely, you can't have any. And certainly, like, bake cookies and treats in your house that you can feel good about. And if you want to use more honey and maple syrup versus cane sugar, go for it. Do the thing that feels good to you in terms of your own values and how you want to eat. But I think that we do kids a disservice by restricting sugar significantly. I think that I know when I studied nutrition, one of the eye-opening things for me was like, oh, it all gets just broken down into the same thing. So whether we eat a sweet or whether we eat brown rice, they all gets broken down into glucose that our body uses. Same thing with all the proteins and the fats. The bottom line is it's not poison to have our kids eat sugar. It's energy. And yes, like we want all that energy to come from a variety of sources. But I think we have to be very careful about demonizing certain foods because then we can create that imbalanced relationship, like you said.
Yeah, no, very true. And I think it's great how you're sort of saying just to really look at your individual child as well. I'm just thinking with my three children as well. I mean, we've got a huge big chocolate box in the kitchen, actually. And actually, I'm probably the one in the family that eats the most chocolate. Even though I'm pretty neutral, but they're even more neutral, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
again, they
Same
are,
here. My kids
yeah.
are much more chill about food than I am in some ways because they grew up in a very different environment than I did in the 70s when it was like the Diet Pepsi era. So,
Sure. If there's a parent listening who's perhaps concerned that they're trying to be more neutral around food, they've got like a range of foods in the house, including sugary foods, but maybe they're finding that one of their children is sneaking food or relying perhaps more on sugar than they would ideally, as a parent, you would ideally like your child to be. Like, how would you address that as well? If a parent notices a child is perhaps really doing a bit of secret eating or really finding it hard to self-regulate when it's freely available.
sure, I hear about that all the time. So, if I have a parent who has that concern, I'd want to chat with them separate from the child because I wouldn't want to put too much focus on that behavior. So, I would wonder about a couple things with the parent. I would wonder, is this a child who's perhaps going through a growth spurt? Is it right before puberty? And some of this is just an appetite thing. Are they coming home from school extra hungry because they like eat lunch so early for example, in the morning, and then they're starving by the time they get home. They just need to have like a little more structure around their snacks, or they need like a more bountiful snack in the afternoon. So is there something like physical going on in terms of the child, like maybe not getting enough food during the day? Are they very distracted during the day and social, and so they don't eat well at school at all? And so they're coming home extra hungry. That would be my first question to sort of investigate with the parent. And then if that's not the issue and it really seems like they're eating adequately throughout the day and their meals are pretty balanced and healthy and all of that, and they seem like well-rounded, then I might be wondering, is there something going on emotionally with this child that they might be using food to help them regulate? I mean, we know that eating stimulates the vagus nerve and it calms us down. So it could be that they're going into their room and soothing with food because they're highly stressed after school or there's something else going on. So I would want to encourage the parent to have a conversation with the child, not necessarily about food, but just kind of checking in with them more. How is school? Is this a child that seems to be very stressed? Are they having a hard time transitioning from one activity to another? And maybe they need less activities. Just do some problem solving around, are there ways in which we can give this young person some more tools for soothing and transition so that food doesn't have to be what they're using.
Oh, yeah, and it's so helpful. And it's interesting, isn't it? I think just you saying about the kind of physical piece as well first. I know myself as a therapist, whenever I'm thinking about a child that might be struggling in that way, my head almost goes completely more for the emotional side of things. It's so obvious in a way, isn't it? Like I know myself, if I'm eating chocolates out of the box when I'm cooking dinner, it's because of my blood sugar's got really low and I've left it a
Yeah.
bit too long.
Mhm.
It's a natural response, isn't it? Yeah, I think it's really helpful to address the physical, but then as well to look at the emotional side of things as well.
Yeah, and often at school, there's so much going on and there's so little time that I don't know about in the UK, but in the US, children get such a short period of time for lunch and outdoor time. They might just grab a few bites and want to go out and play with their friends. And I totally get that. But then what happens is they come home from school and they're super hungry, maybe even hangry. And sometimes it's just a little education around, okay, the first thing we do when we get in the house is we have sit down and we have like a good snack, which might actually help them to be able to focus on the rest of the afternoon. Sometimes it is a mechanical, physical, nutritional problem. And that's almost easier than the emotional stuff. The emotional stuff is a little bit more complicated, obviously, but also important to address before it becomes sort of a lifelong pattern, which obviously we hear with a lot of adults that like this sort of secretive eating is something that they carried from their childhood.
Yeah, and it's so true, isn't it? It's very common, isn't it, when you sort of see someone in the therapy room for consultation that they've struggled with some of these issues from very, very young. So getting in early can be so helpful.
Absolutely. And sometimes all the child might need is to have someone sit down and chat with them when they get home from school to help them transition from an overstimulating environment. And if the parent can't do that because they're working, maybe there's a teen in the neighborhood who could do that. Or sometimes it's just community around the child and kind of ramping that up can be super helpful.
Yeah, I'm sure. Okay, so what about sort of body image as well? Very challenging for kids, isn't it? For boys and girls these days growing up, a lot of pressure. And I'm wondering as well, particularly if you have a child, if you're listening as a parent and you have a child who's not in a conventionally acceptable body. Like I think there is such a thing, isn't there, as thin privilege, and a child may have an easier ride if they fit more into kind of societal ideals, which are really toxic and limiting. I'm wondering, like, do you have some thoughts around that? I mean, I guess there's the more kind of just general body image stuff for young people generally, but then also as well, if you're taller, you're bigger boned, you're just a more muscular frame, there's definitely going to be the tendency, isn't there, for that child probably to compare themselves a bit more or maybe sort of face some certain more issues. So yeah, any sort of thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I think no matter the size of your children, I think talking about body diversity is so critical because it's the people who have thin privilege that often perpetuate the problem, sometimes without even realizing it. If you hear that a child is being teased about their size, well, first of all, you want to have like a no tolerance for that behavior in your own children. But if somebody is talking about having experienced some teasing for their body, then you want to sit down and have a conversation with them about body diversity. And you also want to just ask them if there's any way that you can support them. Because unfortunately, like lots of isms, it's not going to go away. But I think that most of the research has showed that kids who have been bullied for a variety of reasons related to their body really just want to know that the adults are on their side and want a little bit more support from adults. That I think is the most important thing that we can do. And obviously, we have to be careful about what we say about our own bodies in front of children. If we're feeling very comfortable and embodied and comfortable in our own skin, then we communicate that to kids as well. But if we're saying negative things about our body or picking apart our bodies verbally in front of our kids, then I think it can be very confusing, especially if because their parent's body is one that they might have in the
Yeah.
future.
Yeah, no, so true, so helpful. So yeah, and I think going back to what you were saying earlier as well about how you had really talked to your own daughters, I guess, and then they had obviously really kind of absorbed that, hadn't they? And then when the friend was talking about her body, it's great in a way, isn't it? If that's just a much more normal part of kind of conversation, really, that those kind of values, those kind of ways of thinking are very, very embedded. And I think what's positive about like the Gen Z growing up, the younger generation are way ahead, aren't they? They're
I
so
agree.
much more accepting of bodies and they will call people out, but they're also dealing with social media and the
Sure.
overload, aren't they? So in some ways, they're so much more forward thinking and so much more kind of accepting in such a helpful way. But then they're also dealing, aren't they, with this just overflow of kind of toxic information as well sometimes.
Absolutely. I have a whole chapter about social media, and it's a tough one because, like you said, there's like an openness in the next generation about diversity of people. And then there's so much influence as well that, like, especially around food and morality around food and bodies and gym culture and all of that. I always encourage parents to ask their children, how does it make you feel when you watch that video or when you pay attention to that account? Is following that account making you feel better about yourself, or is it making you feel worse about yourself? That's a good question if you're doing a little social media literacy with your kids, so that they're following the things that feel inspirational and helpful and not following the things that make them feel less than.
Yeah, no, sure. So it's really like checking in with yourself, isn't it? Really like encouraging your child to really be in the body, connecting with their feelings, developing that self-trust. Because I'm thinking as well, so many of my kind of younger clients, they will come into therapy now. And in a way, they have all the knowledge. They kind of know about body positivity, body neutrality. Like they've read about the Minnesota starvation study. Like they know all the facts, but it's almost like it hasn't really got under the skin. And it takes time, doesn't it, to get under the skin? Part of that is just growing up and takes time for us to integrate everything and embody it and truly develop. That's a lifetime job, isn't it? But
Yeah, and our culture is so toxic. I mean, from an early age, most of the villains in children's movies and television, and even probably in picture books, I haven't seen the statistics on that, but definitely in video, most of the media depicts the villains in larger bodies and the sort of heroes in smaller or more muscular bodies. So it's been like embedded from a very early age, sadly. And we just have to change that over the top everywhere. And it's a slow process.
yeah, no, sure. We will get there, won't we? But it might not be
I
in
hope so.
our lifetime.
I hope so. All we can do is keep working on it and talking about this, right? And supporting each other in having a different view so that we can all just feel comfortable in our own skin and enjoy food. Like, I think that's so critical. Like, we want food to be fun and nourishing and a way for families to come together Obviously, we survive by eating, but we also bring people together around food. We want it to be positive for our young people.
Sure. And that was the last sort of point I was going to ask you about, actually. But I know you really sort of advocate pleasure and families getting together, and not just about kind of nutrition necessarily, but really the joy, the connection. Is there anything more that you wanted to add to that?
No, I think actually pleasure and nourishment through food is actually more important than nutrition. Is that okay for me to say? Given that I've been doing this work for the last 30 years, even as a nutritionist, I think that kids don't need to know a whole lot about nutrition. They naturally gravitate towards a variety of food if we leave them alone for the most part. But they do need to have a nice, easeful, peaceful environment around food. I think that's so critical, maybe even more critical than nutrition. If I
Sure.
say that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's just really helpful reminder, isn't it? Because I think we often just forget, actually, for children, they like just a nice kind of boring, predictable, regular routine provides a lot of safety for a child, doesn't it? Where you know
Absolutely.
what's going to happen, and just where it's peaceful and there's not a lot of drama. Actually, if you can provide that for your child, you're kind of halfway there, aren't you?
Right. And knowing that as they get older, things shift and they have to learn that life isn't always predictable and routine. But you're right, especially for the young child, knowing that we always have soup on Monday night or whatever, and we always have something on another night can actually be helpful to have that routine. Variety is important, but consistency and peacefulness around food is probably even more important.
Yeah, and it's sure. So
At
it's a
least in terms of
balance.
preventing eating disorders.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I guess we're not talking about super rigid, are we? We're talking about kind of a loose kind of structure, really, of stability, not about oh my God, it's got to be really, really rigid and specific.
No.
Okay, well, Heidi, thank you so much. I mean, I think so many kind of pearls of wisdom in all of that I know the listeners are going to find incredibly helpful. So can you just give us just tell us again quickly about your most recent book, and also where can people find you as well?
So my most recent book is called Nurture, and the subtitle is How to Raise Kids Who Love Food, Their Bodies, and Themselves. I know it's available through Amazon and all the different countries that Amazon goes to, but it's because my distributor is Ingram Spark. You should be able to get it at bookstores as well. So please ask your local bookseller if they can get it for you, and they should be able to do that. It should be available at all libraries and bookstores. That's certainly in the US, but I'm thinking that may be this case for UK as well. I'm going to confirm that for you. My website is anourishingword.com, and you can also read my newsletter on Substack. It's Nourishing Words. So you can sign up for my newsletter if you'd like to get more information like what we've been talking about right to your inbox.
Okay, brilliant. And I know you've sent me all those links already, Heidi, so I'll make sure they're in the show notes so people can get in touch or go and read your info. That'd be so helpful.
You're so welcome. Thank you so much for having me. It's a good conversation, an important one. So I appreciate you wanting to have it.
Okay, thanks so much, Heidi. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation just as much as I did. Do go and check out all of Heidi's info in the show notes. If you're not following me already, do seek me out on Instagram at the Eating Disorder Therapist _ for further support with your relationship with food. Do go to the eatingdisordertherapist.co.uk. If you enjoyed this podcast, I'll be so grateful if you'd follow, rate and review, as it helps it reach so many more listeners. Thank you so much for listening today, and I look forward to sharing another podcast episode with you very soon.